The air in the dining room felt thick, heavy with the scent of roasted turkey, canned cranberry sauce, and the cloying sweetness of pumpkin pie. Outside, the late November sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long, weak shadows through the bay window. Inside, the warmth from the oven did little to cut the chill that settled deep in my bones. It was a performative warmth, like the smiles stretched across faces around the long, polished table. Smiles that didn't reach the eyes. My husband, Mark, was holding court at the head of the table. His voice, booming and confident, cut through the low murmur of polite conversation, drawing the attention of aunts, uncles, cousins, and our parents. He was telling a story about a crazy startup idea one of his colleagues had pitched, his eyes sweeping the room, basking in the forced chuckles and nods. He paused, took a sip of water, and then, his gaze landing on me, his smile sharpened just a fraction. It didn't look like a smile anymore. It looked like a knife blade catching the light. Speaking of entrepreneurial spirit, he said, his voice dripping with patronizing amusement, Sarah here has been dabbling in her little project. He used air quotes, making the word project sound utterly insignificant, like a child's finger painting. My stomach tightened. I felt every eye at the table pivot towards me. My mother offered a weak, encouraging smile that held a hint of pity. My father looked down at his plate. Oh yes. Aunt Carol, bless her naive heart, chimed in. What is it, dear? A craft Etsy shop. Mark chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that vibrated in the air and felt like a physical blow. Something like that, he said, not letting me answer. She spends a lot of time on it. Late nights. Typing away furiously. I tell her, honey, maybe focus on something more practical? But she's determined. Says it's going to be big. He winked at his brother across the table, who smirked back. The message was clear. My project was a foolish, time-wasting hobby, a delusion I indulged while he, the sensible, successful husband, provided our comfortable life. His eyes held a familiar mix of condescension and barely concealed contempt, the look he reserved for my perceived inadequacies. It was a look I had grown accustomed to over 15 years. A look that had chipped away at me, piece by careful piece, until I felt like nothing but dust motes dancing in the harsh light of his judgment. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. The air suddenly felt too thin to breathe. The polite smiles around the table shifted, becoming uncomfortable, uncertain. They knew Mark. They knew his way of gently, or not so gently, putting people in their place. And tonight I was his chosen target. Again. He leaned back in his chair, expansive, in control. I keep telling her, he continued, oblivious or indifferent to my discomfort. The market for whatever it is saturated. You need real capital, real connections. Not just dreams and a laptop. He laughed again, and a few people around the table joined in nervously. It was the sound of my aspirations being publicly ridiculed, dismantled, and thrown into the garbage. It was the sound of years of quiet effort being dismissed as a frivolous phase. I wanted to sink through the floor. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But most of all, I wanted the ground to open up and swallow him whole. The injustice of it, the sheer, calculated cruelty of choosing this moment, this public stage, to belittle me, was a physical ache in my chest. He wasn't just mocking my work, he was mocking me. My intelligence, my ambition, my very capability. In front of everyone who mattered to us, or who was supposed to matter. His family. My family. This is where I was. Sitting at a Thanksgiving table, surrounded by people who mostly cared but were too polite or too scared to intervene, being torn down by the man who stood, supposedly, by my side. The man who had sworn to support me, cherish me, lift me up. Instead, he preferred to keep me small, manageable, a reflection of his own perceived superiority. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. It hadn't always been like this. In the beginning, there was laughter, shared dreams, a sense of being a team. We met in college, young and full of boundless optimism. He was charismatic, driven, already mapping out his path to success. I was quieter, more analytical, drawn to the subtle complexities of systems and human behavior. We balanced each other, or so it seemed. He admired my intellect, he said. My perspective was a valuable counterpoint to his bold, sometimes reckless, ambition. But somewhere along the way, the balance shifted. His career took off rapidly. Mine didn't follow a traditional trajectory. I worked in various roles, always learning, always observing, but never chasing the corporate ladder with the same single-minded ferocity he did. And as his star rose, he seemed to need mine to dim in comparison. It started subtly. Little jabs masked as jokes. Oh, you're thinking about that? Interesting. A bit. Niche, isn't it? Or, if you put half the energy you put into your reading, into networking, maybe you'd see some real progress. It escalated after we married. The house, the cars, the vacations, they were all his achievements, bought with his money. My contributions, whether it was managing the household, supporting his career, or pursuing my own interests, were framed as secondary, less important, often invisible. My desire to create something of my own, something that didn't fit into his neat box of acceptable female pursuits, like decorating or planning dinner parties, was met with increasing resistance. I started working on my project, a complex data analytics platform I believed could revolutionize how small businesses understood their customers, almost 3 years ago. It began as an idea, a nagging question that wouldn't leave me alone. I saw a gap in the market, a way to make sophisticated tools accessible to people who couldn't afford enterprise-level software. It required endless research, coding, testing, building a financial model, writing a business plan. It was exhilarating and terrifying. It felt like the first truly independent thing I had done in years. I worked in secret at first. Late nights after Mark had gone to bed, hunched over my laptop in the spare room I'd turned into a makeshift office. Early mornings before he woke up. Stolen hours on weekends when he was golfing or networking. It was exhausting. The secrecy was a heavy cloak, weighing me down. But revealing it meant facing his predictable dismissal. So I stayed hidden. My first attempts were clumsy, frustrating. Code wouldn't compile. The financial projections didn't make sense. I pored over tutorials, joined online forums under a pseudonym, taught myself new programming languages. There were moments of despair, staring at a screen of errors, feeling utterly incompetent, hearing Mark's voice in my head saying, "See? I told you. It's not that simple." He would sometimes wander into the spare room late at night, seeing the glow of the screen. "Still playing with your little computer project, Sarah?" he'd say, his tone light but laced with condescension. "Don't stay up too late. You'll be tired tomorrow." It wasn't concern. It was a reminder that he saw it as child's play. He had no idea the scope, the ambition, the sheer work I was pouring into it. He never asked specifics. He didn't care. It wasn't part of his world of mergers, acquisitions, and golf course deals. Therefore, it wasn't real. The challenges mounted. I needed seed funding, but pitching to investors felt impossible. My confidence, battered by years of Mark's subtle attacks, was fragile. I practiced my pitch alone in the spare room, stumbling over words, feeling foolish. The loneliness was profound. I couldn't talk to Mark about the setbacks, the moments of doubt, the small victories that kept me going. He wouldn't understand, or worse, he would use them as further proof of my folly. I reached out to a few women I knew from past jobs, entrepreneurs themselves. They offered encouragement, advice, a lifeline in the isolation. They were the only people who knew what I was really doing, who saw its potential. They became my silent partners in this clandestine endeavor. Their belief in me was a tiny, flickering candle in the darkness Mark had created. One significant challenge was the funding. I had bootstrapped for as long as possible, draining my small savings. I needed more to build out the full platform, hire a developer, start marketing. I researched angel investors, venture capitalists. It felt like a world light years away from my quiet spare room. Mark controlled our joint finances, of course, and asking him for a significant sum for my little project was unthinkable. It would require transparency I wasn't ready for and would surely be met with derision. I considered taking out a loan in my own name, but the risk felt enormous. What if I failed? The thought paralyzed me. The pressure of the secrecy was immense. Juggling my secret work with maintaining a semblance of normalcy, attending Mark's work events, hosting dinners, listening to his endless stories about the office. It was exhausting. I felt like I was living a double life, one where I was the supportive, somewhat naive wife, and another where I was a driven founder building something from the ground up. The strain was visible, I think, though Mark probably just attributed it to me being stressed or moody. He never considered that his own behavior might be the source of my stress. He rarely considered my feelings at all, unless they inconvenienced him. There was a particularly bad night, maybe a year into the project. I had stayed up until 3 a.m. working on a complex algorithm. It finally clicked, and I felt a surge of exhilaration, a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. I wanted to share it with someone. Anyone. I woke Mark up, shaking his shoulder gently. Mark? I did it. I fixed the core algorithm. It works. He mumbled something, rolled over, and pulled the covers tighter. That's nice, Sarah, he slurred, half asleep. Go back to bed. You'll wake the neighbors with your coding excitement. He fell back asleep instantly. I stood there in the dark, the taste of victory turning to ash in my mouth. That was the moment the midpoint shift truly began. It wasn't just about building a successful business anymore. It was about proving him wrong. Not just to him, but to myself. His indifference was a colder, sharper pain than his active mockery. It solidified my resolve. I would finish this. I would make it undeniable. After that night, my approach changed. I stopped seeking his approval, or even his acknowledgement. I built a wall around my project, making it entirely separate from my life with him. It became my sanctuary, my secret weapon. I focused on the work with a new intensity, fueled by a quiet rage. I found a small, early-stage funding program specifically for women entrepreneurs. It was competitive, grueling, but it didn't require his sign-off or knowledge. I applied, went through rounds of interviews, pitched my idea to a panel of skeptical but fair judges. It was terrifying, but each step forward felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Against the odds, I got accepted. It was a small amount of money, enough to hire one part-time developer and cover some initial marketing costs, but it felt like a fortune. It was validation. Real, external validation that didn't depend on Mark's limited, biased perspective. I signed the papers in a coffee shop, my hand trembling slightly, feeling like a spy completing a crucial mission. I deposited the money into a separate bank account, one he didn't know about. The secrecy continued, but now it felt less like hiding and more like strategic protection. With the funding, the project accelerated. The developer, a brilliant young woman named Chloe, helped me refine the platform. We worked remotely, communicating mostly through encrypted messages and video calls. It felt like building a secret society, one dedicated to proving that my little project was anything but. The challenges didn't disappear. We hit technical snags, marketing campaigns flopped, sleepless nights became the norm. There were days I felt like giving up, completely overwhelmed by the scale of what I was trying to do, the weight of the secrecy, and the constant low-level drain of living with Mark. He seemed to sense the shift in me, the fact that my focus was increasingly elsewhere. He became more critical, more demanding of my attention. "You're always on that phone," he'd complain, or, "Are you even listening to me?" He didn't know I was securing major contracts, negotiating partnerships, building a team of beta testers who loved the platform. He didn't know the late-night calls were with potential clients on the West Coast or developers in India. He just saw me distracted, less available to cater to his needs, and he didn't like it. His dismissiveness grew sharper, laced with annoyance. He'd make comments about my hobby needing to pay the bills someday, usually accompanied by a humorless laugh. The deepening crisis arrived in the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving. My company, yes, my company, it was real now, incorporated with clients and revenue, had been gaining traction faster than I'd anticipated. We'd solved a major scalability issue, onboarded several significant clients, and the user feedback was overwhelmingly positive. My name was starting to appear in industry blogs, quiet mentions of an innovative new platform shaking things up. Then came the email. An editor from Forbes wanted to interview me. They were doing a piece on disruptive tech startups, specifically focusing on founders who were breaking into traditionally male-dominated fields. My heart hammered in my chest when I read it.
Forbes.
The magazine Mark read religiously, the one he cited as the ultimate measure of success. The irony wasn't lost on me. The interview went well, though I was a nervous wreck. I couldn't tell Mark, of course. It would either provoke his skepticism. Forbes? Really, Sarah? Are you sure it's not just a local newsletter? Or, worse, a sudden, unwelcome interest in my project now that it had a whiff of prestige.
Il chose silence.
The secrecy felt like a cage sometimes, but it was also my shield. Thanksgiving plans were already set. His family, my family, the same predictable gathering at our house. The dread built in my stomach like a lead weight. I knew Mark would perform for his family, emphasizing his success, downplaying mine if he even mentioned it at all. The Forbes article was scheduled to be released sometime around then. They hadn't given me an exact date, just late November. The thought of it dropping while I was trapped at that dinner, listening to him, was both terrifying and, I admit, thrilling. The turning point was subtle. It happened a few days before Thanksgiving. Mark made a particularly cutting remark about my work ethic, comparing me unfavorably to a highly driven male CEO he admired. Now that's what success looks like, Sarah, he'd said, gesturing vaguely in the direction of his business magazines.
Not.
Pottering around on a laptop, something inside me snapped. It wasn't just the usual dismissiveness. It was a complete erasure of my effort, my potential, my very being as a capable person. In that moment, sitting across from him at the breakfast table, the carefully constructed wall around my emotions crumbled, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. I wasn't just going to finish my project. I was going to make it undeniable. And I wasn't going to hide it anymore. Not ever again. I went into Thanksgiving dinner with a strange sense of calm. The storm had been brewing for years, the pressure building. I knew it was likely to break tonight. I wore a simple, elegant dress, something that made me feel strong, not invisible. I helped set the table, arrange the food, played the part of the gracious hostess. Inside, however, a quiet battle plan was forming. I would let him have his moment. I would endure the predictable jabs. And then, I would wait. The dinner began. The usual small talk, the clinking of silverware, the background hum of conversation. Mark was on fine form, dominating the discussion with stories of his latest business triumph. I listened, nodded, smiled on cue, my mind racing. Was the article out yet? Had anyone seen it? My phone was tucked away in my pocket, vibrating occasionally with notifications I couldn't check. Each vibration sent a jolt of anxiety mixed with anticipation through me. Then came the moment from the beginning. Mark, drawing the room's attention, turning his condescending gaze on me. His words, like tiny, poison darts. Speaking of entrepreneurial spirit, Sarah here has been dabbling in her little project, the air quotes. The patronizing tone. The way he made project sound like a childish game. The nervous laughter from around the table. The familiar heat rising in my cheeks. He continued, building his little comedy routine at my expense. She spends a lot of time on it. Late nights. Typing away furiously. I tell her, honey, maybe focus on something more practical? But she's determined. Says it's going to be big, the wink to his brother. The shared smirk. I keep telling her the market for whatever it is saturated. You need real capital, real connections, not just dreams and a laptop, the mocking laugh. The silence that followed felt eternal. Everyone was looking at me, some with pity, some with awkwardness, some with that subtle judgment that confirms you are indeed the topic of family gossip. I forced myself to meet their eyes. I didn't look away. I didn't crumble. I felt a strange detachment, as if watching the scene unfold from a distance. His words were the same old tired lines, but tonight, they didn't have the power to wound me in the same way. Because tonight, the truth was a silent, invisible guest at the table. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, perhaps a dry retort I'd rehearsed in my head, or maybe just a simple, "It's not a hobby, Mark," but before I could speak, a voice from across the table interrupted. It was Mark's Uncle Ted, a gruff, usually silent man who spent most family gatherings watching sports on his tablet. "Hold on a sec," he said, not looking up from the device in his hands. "Did anyone else see this? Just got an alert." All eyes turned to Uncle Ted. Mark looked annoyed, his performance interrupted. "See what, Ted?" he asked, impatient. Uncle Ted zoomed in on a screen, squinting. "This Forbes list, 30 under 40, disruptors in tech. Got a name on here? Sounds familiar." He tapped the screen. "Yeah, here it is. Sarah Jensen. Says she's the founder and CEO of Nexus Analytics." He looked up, his brow furrowed in confusion, scanning the faces around the table until his eyes landed on me. "Sarah? Is that you? Nexus Analytics?" The room fell utterly silent. Not the awkward silence after Mark's jokes, but a stunned, absolute stillness. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. All eyes, which moments ago had been fixed on Uncle Ted or me with pity, were now wide with disbelief. Mark froze. The smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a look of utter shock, then bewilderment. His mouth was slightly open. He looked at Uncle Ted, then at me, then back at Uncle Ted, as if trying to compute the information.
Sarah
Jensen, he stammered, his voice a low, strangled sound. "Nexus Analytics." I nodded, my voice quiet, steady. "Yes, Uncle Ted. That's me. And my company." Uncle Ted's eyes widened further. He looked at the screen again, then back at me, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "Says here you just secured series of funding. Multi-million-dollar valuation." He looked at Mark. "You knew about this, Mark?" Mark couldn't speak. He just stared at me, his face pale, his eyes wide and darting. He looked like he'd been hit by lightning. He had no idea. Absolutely no idea. My little project he'd mocked relentlessly for years was a multi-million-dollar company, and I was on the Forbes list of top young entrepreneurs. The plot twist wasn't just that I had succeeded. It was that I had succeeded in secret, building this entire reality parallel to his, and the revelation was happening in the most public, spectacular way possible, catching him completely off guard in the very moment he was trying to publicly diminish me. His own words about real capital and connections hung in the air, a bitter, ironic echo. He had dismissed my dreams and a laptop. I had built an empire with them. Slowly, the silence broke. A murmur rippled through the room. Questions started to overlap. "Forbes list? Sarah, that's amazing. Nexus Analytics? I think I read about them. Multi-million-dollar? My God." My mother burst into tears, rushing over to hug me, squeezing me tight. My father's eyes were shining. Mark was still sitting there, frozen. He hadn't moved. His plate of untouched food sat in front of him. His face was a mask of shock, confusion, and a dawning, sickening realization. The room had fallen silent for him earlier, but now it was silent at him. His carefully constructed image of the successful husband with the hobbyist wife had just imploded publicly, spectacularly, and irrevocably. The climax wasn't just the announcement. It was the look on his face. The absolute, utter blindsiding. The dawning horror as he realized the depth of his ignorance, the scale of my achievement, and the public humiliation he had just inflicted upon himself by mocking me moments before the truth was revealed. The knife he had wielded against me had turned in his own hand. The dinner devolved into chaos. Everyone wanted to talk to me, to ask questions. I was gracious, composed, answering their inquiries, explaining briefly what Nexus Analytics did, how it started. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth, revealed so dramatically, was vindication enough. I met Mark's stunned gaze across the table. There was no anger in his eyes anymore, just a raw, naked disbelief, and something that looked like fear. The king of his castle had been dethroned, not by force, but by his own blindness and my quiet perseverance. The rest of the evening was a blur. People kept coming up to me, congratulating me, asking for my card. Mark sat in a corner, nursing a drink, looking shell-shocked. He tried to join a few conversations, but his usual bluster was gone. He looked
small.
For the first time in 15 years, he looked smaller than me. When the last guest finally left, the house was quiet except for the lingering smell of roasted turkey and the faint clinking of dishes as I started to clear the table. Mark was still in the living room, slumped on the sofa, staring straight ahead. I walked into the living room, stood in front of him. He didn't look up. "Mark," I said, my voice soft but firm. He flinched. Slowly, he raised his head. His eyes met mine. There was a flicker of the old arrogance, quickly extinguished by the fresh burn of his public humiliation. "Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse. I didn't know." "No," I said. "You didn't. You never wanted to." It was easier to believe it was just a hobby. He swallowed, looking away. "Why didn't you tell me?" I almost laughed. The sheer absurdity of the question. "Tell you? Every time I even hinted at it, you dismissed it. You mocked it. You told me I was wasting my time. You wanted me to fail, Mark. Or, at least, you needed me to be less successful than you." He flinched again, but he didn't deny it. Silence stretched between us, thick with years of unacknowledged pain and resentment. The comfortable life he had built, the one he used to lord over me, suddenly felt fragile, built on sand. My success wasn't just my own, it was a mirror reflecting the fundamental imbalance in our relationship. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know, Mark," I said honestly. The victory felt bittersweet. The liberation was immense, but it came at a cost. The cost of a marriage, of years spent trying to fit into a box I was never meant for. The feeling of loneliness returned, sharp and sudden. I had achieved my dream, but the person who should have been happiest for me was the one I had to hide it from. And now, the hiding was over, and the truth was a wrecking ball. I walked over to the bay window, looked out at the dark night. The stars were out, cold and distant. I had reached for one, and against all his predictions, I had caught it. But the climb had been solitary. The days and weeks that followed Thanksgiving were a whirlwind. My name and company were everywhere. Interviews, podcasts, speaking invitations. My little project was now a real, tangible force in the market. The business demanded my full attention, and for the first time, I gave it without reservation, without the need to hide. My relationship with Mark disintegrated rapidly. The foundation had been hollowed out years ago by his constant dismissiveness, and my secret success was the final blow that made the structure collapse. He couldn't handle the shift in power dynamics. He couldn't handle my success, especially the fact that it was so undeniable, so public, and so independent of him. The man who needed me to be small couldn't cope with me being significant. There were arguments, accusations, attempts at reconciliation that felt hollow and performative. We both knew it was over. The silence in the house was now heavy with absence, not just secrets. The legal proceedings were relatively clean. He couldn't claim any part of my company, of course. I had built it entirely independently, with separate funds and no reliance on his resources or connections. He was left with the house, the cars, the trappings of the life he had built and which he thought defined him. I walked away with my company, my freedom, and a quiet sense of vindication. The aftermath wasn't a Hollywood ending with me riding off into the sunset completely unscathed. There was grief for the marriage that never truly was, for the years spent trying to earn the approval of someone incapable of giving it. There was the loneliness that came with massive success when your most intimate relationship crumbles. But there was also an incredible sense of freedom, a lightness I hadn't felt in years. I could finally be myself, openly and unapologetically. My voice, silenced for so long, was now being heard. I moved into a small apartment downtown, closer to my new office. It was a stark contrast to the sprawling house I'd shared with Mark, but it felt like mine. Every piece of furniture, every decoration, was a choice I made for myself. The spare room wasn't a hiding place anymore. It was just a room, full of boxes waiting to be unpacked. Building Nexus Analytics had been my quiet rebellion, my act of defiance. I hadn't set out to humiliate Mark, but his public mockery at Thanksgiving had amplified the moment of truth into something far more impactful than I could have planned. He had tried to use that table, that gathering, to cement his narrative of my inadequacy. Instead, I had inadvertently used it to announce my arrival. Success felt different than I had imagined. It wasn't just about the money or the recognition. It was about reclaiming my narrative, validating my worth, proving that the quiet, persistent work I had done in the shadows was not only real, but powerful. It was about finally believing in myself, because the numbers, the clients, the Forbes list, they were undeniable proof that I was capable of building something significant, something that mattered. The scars remained, of course. Years of being chipped away at leaves marks. But they were also a reminder of how far I had come, how much I had endured, and how much stronger I was for it. I had faced the storm he had created, weathered it in secret, and emerged not just alive, but thriving. Sometimes late at night in my new, quiet apartment, I think about that Thanksgiving dinner. The smell of turkey, the forced smiles, the sound of his mocking laugh. And then, the sudden silence, the stunned faces, the look on Mark's face when Uncle Ted read my name. It's a moment etched into my memory, a pivot point in my life. It was the end of one story, a story of being diminished and unseen, and the beginning of another, a story of quiet strength, resilience, and the undeniable power of building your own truth. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.